He could barely stand. His legs were braced in cold, unforgiving metal. Yet, in front of hundreds of wealthy guests, cameras, and executives, this disabled boy reached out, not for help, not for pity, but to ask a black woman serving water if she would dance with him. And what she did next silenced the room, shook a billionaire to his core, and quietly sparked a revolution that would change the way America helps its children heal. This isn't just a story about a dance. It's about dignity, defiance, and the day a woman with no title showed the world what true leadership really looks like. Stay with us. Because by the end, you'll see how one small gesture can turn into a movement that rewrites the rules of power, parenting, and what it means to follow. The chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling of the San Diego Convention Center's grand atrium cast a golden glow over polished marble floors and meticulously arranged banquet tables, each adorned with custom-cut crystal centerpieces and name cards embossed in gold foil. Tonight was the Wallace Foundation's annual gala, a celebration of technological advancement in biomedical rehabilitation, and the guest list included an impressive array of tech moguls, medical researchers, and policy influencers. Waiters glided silently between tables, their movements choreographed with the precision of a ballet troupe, while a soft string quartet played in the background. In this curated world of privilege and perfection, one anomaly stood out. A boy, no more than 9 years old, and seated awkwardly at a table near the stage, his legs encased in orthopedic braces that gleamed under the lights. His name was Eli Wallace, son of Gregory Wallace, the host of the evening and CEO of Wallace Biotech, a man known not only for his billion-dollar empire in neurological tech, but also for his uncompromising control over every detail of his life and company. It was the first time Eli had appeared in public since the car accident that had damaged his spinal cord 2 years earlier, leaving him partially paralyzed and mostly silent. Seated beside him was no nanny, no elite child therapist, only a woman in a crisp blue button-down and gray slacks, her curly hair tucked neatly under a simple navy cap. Her name was Leona Carter. To most of the attendees, she was invisible, a school bus driver hired through a temporary agency, now repurposed as part-time event staff to help coordinate backstage logistics. She was tasked with refilling water glasses, guiding guests, and blending into the background. But as the MC finished announcing the next musical interlude, and the stage lights dimmed to signal a transition, something unexpected happened. The quartet shifted into a soft waltz, and Eli, clutching the edge of his chair with trembling fingers, slowly turned toward Leona. His voice, small and unsure, barely carried over the clinking of glassware. "Will you dance with me?" The question was so simple, so startling in its innocence, that Leona froze. Her gaze met his, and in that instant, she saw not the heir to a technological dynasty, or the boy whose last words had been murmured through hospital oxygen, but a child yearning to be seen. Before she could respond, a voice sliced through the soft music like a razor. "Miss Carter, stand down immediately," barked Alan Monroe, the gala's event coordinator, his earpiece blinking red as he marched toward the edge of the stage. "This is not a dance floor, and you are not here to entertain guests." Gasps flitted through the room like sparks jumping between exposed wires. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward the scene unfolding under the chandelier. Gregory Wallace, whose reputation could shift markets with a single quote, stood slowly, his jaw set in a cold, unreadable line. He cleared his throat, clearly about to restore order. But Leona moved first. She removed her gloves and tucked them neatly into her back pocket. Then, with a grace that seemed both defiant and serene, she extended her hand to Eli. "Only if I don't have to lead," she said softly. The boy smiled, a smile so fragile and genuine, it seemed to hush the entire atrium. Leona helped him to his feet, adjusting her pace to match his, as the two took halting steps onto the open floor. The metal of Eli's braces scraped audibly against the stone tiles, but the music never stopped. Neither did they. They moved, not with skill or rhythm, but with a kind of sacred slowness, as if every inch gained was a declaration against despair. Gregory took a step forward, his face hardening. "What the hell is she doing?" he whispered to no one in particular. Alan Monroe leaned in. "We'll have her fired first thing tomorrow." But Gregory didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind had been hijacked by a memory. His late wife, Elise, dancing barefoot in their sunroom, with a much younger Eli wrapped around her waist. "Don't teach him perfection," she used to say. "Teach him connection." Now, as he watched his son lead, not be guided or corrected, but actually lead, his carefully walled heart began to tremble. Guests whispered behind manicured hands. "She's going to lose her job. Why is no one stopping them? Is that the Wallace boy?" Still, Leona didn't break eye contact with Eli. She followed every uncertain movement with quiet reverence, as if the entire evening had been planned just for this. 3 steps, that's all they took. But those 3 steps shattered the glass dome of expectation and exposed something no amount of prestige or money could orchestrate: humanity. When the dance ended, Leona led Eli gently back to his chair, then straightened up and addressed him with a respectful nod. "Thank you for the dance, young man. It was an honor." As she turned to leave, Gregory's voice, low and hoarse, rang out. "Wait." She stopped. He approached slowly, eyes unreadable. "Your name," he said. "What's your full name?" "Leona Carter, sir." He repeated it under his breath, as if etching it onto his soul. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a business card, and held it out to her. "My office, 9 a.m. sharp." Leona took the card without expression, though her fingers trembled slightly. She gave a brief nod and disappeared into the shadows of the staff corridor. Back at the table, Eli looked up at his father with a strange mix of hope and confusion. "Why did you do that?" he asked. Gregory had no answer. For a moment, he didn't see the boy as a fragile responsibility or a reminder of medical failure. He saw a child, his child, who had taken initiative, who had dared to rise when the world expected him to sit quietly and behave. The rest of the evening proceeded in a surreal haze. Courses were served, speeches were made, donations were pledged. But for Gregory Wallace, none of it mattered. The only thing echoing in his mind was the sound of a metal brace scraping against marble, and the quiet strength of a woman who had dared to accept a dance. He had spent years funding robotic exoskeletons and AI-enhanced neural pathways, seeking a technological miracle that would fix his son. And yet, in less than 60 seconds, a woman society overlooked had offered something no machine could replicate: dignity. Outside, beneath the California stars, Leona waited for her rideshare, the cool air brushing against her cheeks. She glanced once more at the business card in her hand, then tucked it into the worn leather notebook she always carried. She wasn't afraid. Not of Gregory Wallace, not of what tomorrow might bring, because she knew something he didn't. This wasn't the end of a dance. It was the beginning of a revolution. And every revolution, she thought, begins with one small, defiant step. The morning sun had just begun to pierce the skyline of downtown San Diego when Leona Carter stood in front of Wallace Tower, a 50-floor monument of power, innovation, and cold precision. The building loomed like a monolith of success, its mirrored surface reflecting not just the clouds above, but also the societal divide it represented. Clad in her best outfit, a navy skirt, white blouse, and worn flats that had once belonged to her sister, Leona took a deep breath, adjusted the strap of her thrift store purse, and stepped inside. The lobby gleamed with marble, chrome, and controlled silence. Executives passed her by without a glance, their tailored suits rustling faintly as they moved with purpose, their confidence as rehearsed as their elevator pitches. The receptionist, a young woman with bone-straight hair and an expression honed by a decade of guarding the gates of privilege, looked up and blinked slowly. "Name?" "Leona Carter. I have a 9 a.m. appointment with Mr. Wallace." The receptionist gave her a once-over, as if scanning a QR code of doubt, before picking up the phone and murmuring into the receiver. A moment later, she gestured toward the elevator. "18th floor. Ms. Rana Winters will receive you." The ride-up was silent, save for the faint hum of the elevator. Leona watched her own reflection in the mirrored interior, not to admire it, but to prepare. She wasn't nervous, not really. She had faced worse: hospital bills, discrimination, watching her sister struggle through chemo. This, she thought, was just another man in a high tower trying to understand what dignity looks like from the ground up. The elevator dinged, and she stepped into a corridor of glass walls, muted carpets, and strategically placed sculptures. Ms. Rena Winters, Gregory Wallace's chief of staff, met her with the polite tension of someone trained to sniff out trouble. Mid-40s with sharp cheekbones and sharper instincts, Winters walked with military efficiency. "Mr. Wallace is in a call. Follow me." As they moved through the corridor, Leona caught the glances, curious, judgmental, some pitying, from office staff behind glass doors. The presence of a black woman dressed in department store clearance among these Prada-clad professionals was enough to ignite whispers. In a small lounge room, Winters paused. "You got fired, didn't you?" Her tone was clinical, not sympathetic. "That's what usually happens when people like you step out of line at events like last night's." Leona turned calm. "People like me." Winters didn't blink. "People who don't know their place." Leona's smile was soft and dangerous. And where would that place be? But before the conversation could detonate, Winters's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and nodded. "He'll see you now." Gregory Wallace's office occupied nearly half the floor, its panoramic windows offering a sweeping view of the city, as though he owned not just the skyline, but the stories within it. He stood facing the glass, hands in his pockets, posture perfect, like a statue carved from regret and calculation. As Leona entered, he didn't turn right away. "Miss Carter," he said evenly, "thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." She didn't. The silence stretched, a deliberate move. Leona recognized it instantly. It was the kind of pause meant to make the other person feel it, reveal insecurity, apologize first. But she remained still, letting the silence curl and settle like dust on an unused shelf. Eventually, Gregory turned, picked up a folder from his desk, and opened it. "Do you have a background?" he asked. "Excuse me?" "Education, degrees." Leona met his gaze without flinching. "Bachelor's in Child Development from UCLA. Master's in Neuropedagogy, unfinished due to family obligations." Something flickered in his eyes. Interest, maybe, or surprise. "And yet, you work as a bus driver." "I work 3 jobs," she corrected. "Bus driver, event staff on weekends, and I tutor special needs children in the evenings, when I can." Gregory exhaled, flipping through the file. "I looked into you after last night. I wanted to understand who you were. Who," he hesitated, "danced with my son." Inside the folder were photos of a warehouse with hand-painted murals, kids laughing in wheelchairs, one wooden sign painted in shaky brushstrokes. Motion Mind Community Program. Leona's body tensed. Of course he found it. "You founded this?" "Co-founded, with my sister Janine, 6 years ago." "A dance program for disabled kids?" "A movement-based rehabilitation initiative grounded in neuroplasticity research," she corrected, her voice low but firm. "We integrate movement autonomy, sensory rhythm, and emotional agency." Gregory closed the file. "And now it's about to shut down due to lack of funding." "That's correct. And you didn't come here to ask for money?" "No, I came because you invited me." For the first time, a smile ghosted across his face, tight and hollow. "Fair enough," he murmured. Then, after a beat, he said, "I want you to work for me." Leona blinked, not comprehending at first. "I beg your pardon?" "As a therapeutic companion for Eli, he won't respond to therapists. He won't talk to specialists. But with you," he trailed off. Leona's expression shifted. Compassion gave way to quiet fury. "You want to hire me like a prescription? That's not what You want me to replicate a moment you didn't create and can't understand. For a price." He stepped back, frustrated. "I can pay you 5 times what you make now." She shook her head. "I don't work for people who only see my color or class before they see my competence." Gregory's mouth tightened. "You're rejecting this opportunity out of pride?" "No," she said calmly. "Out of dignity. Your son doesn't need another expert. He needs someone who will let him lead. Someone who knows he's not broken. Just caged." She reached into her purse and slid a card across the desk. "We run classes Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 o'clock. The first class is free. If Eli wants to come, he's welcome." She turned to leave. "Miss Carter?" "No," she said gently. "No more offers, just show up or don't." As the door closed behind her, Gregory remained motionless, the card in his hand suddenly heavier than all the data he had ever collected. Something about the way she said it, like she already knew what came next. And maybe, somewhere deep beneath his perfectly sculpted exterior, he knew too. 3 days later, the scent of rain clung to the cracked pavement outside, an old warehouse tucked behind a row of faded apartment buildings in East Oakland, where weathered murals painted by neighborhood kids stretched across the walls like silent protests of hope. Inside, the Motion Mind Community Center pulsed with quiet energy. No grand equipment, no blinking machines, just music, mats, and children moving through space at their own rhythm. Leona stood behind the modest reception desk, entering attendance into a second-hand laptop with a broken E-key when her sister Janine burst through the side door, eyes wide, her hijab slightly askew from haste. "There's a Bentley outside," she whispered breathless, "and you won't believe who's sitting in the back seat." Leona didn't have to look. She already knew. Stepping toward the window, she saw it, polished black chrome rims, the unmistakable quiet arrogance of wealth, parked beside a row of rusting minivans. Inside the back seat, Eli Wallace pressed his forehead to the glass, scanning the unfamiliar environment with anxious eyes. In the front seat, Gregory Wallace sat rigid, both hands still clamped on the steering wheel, as if he hadn't yet made up his mind whether to leave. "He's not coming in," Janine said under her breath. "Men like that don't step into places like this." But Leona smiled, remembering the look in Eli's eyes the night he danced. "Don't underestimate a determined son," she said. And then the car door opened. Eli stepped out first, slowly, adjusting the straps of his braces as he studied the uneven sidewalk. A second later, in what seemed like a gesture forced by something more than pride, Gregory followed, his designer sweater a little too crisp, his sneakers looking newly purchased and painfully out of place. He surveyed the building, the noise inside, the kids rolling by in wheelchairs and braces, and, for a moment, he looked like a man on the verge of turning around. But Eli was already walking. Leona opened the door for them. "Mr. Wallace," she said, neutral and respectful. "Welcome." Inside, the chaos had rhythm. A girl with cerebral palsy twirled her wheelchair with artistic flair. A boy with a prosthetic limb drummed his steps to a syncopated beat, echoing from an old Bluetooth speaker. Gregory glanced around, visibly uncomfortable. "It looks chaotic." "There is structure," Leona said, eyes fixed on the children. "Just not the kind you're used to recognizing." Eli hovered at the edge of the activity, watching, absorbing. "Would you like to join?" Leona asked gently. Eli looked to his father for approval. Gregory's lips pressed into a tense line. "Go on," he said at last. "I'll be right here." As Leona guided Eli into the group, Janine approached Gregory and offered him a metal folding chair. "The first day is always the hardest," she said. "For the parents, not the kids." "This isn't therapy," Gregory replied defensively. "I've hired the best specialists in the country." Janine's voice was soft, almost pitying. "And how's that working for Eli?" Before he could answer, the studio door creaked open, and an older woman entered, a figure with silver braids pinned elegantly atop her head, walking with a cane that didn't diminish the power in her presence. She moved through the room like someone who had nothing to prove and no time to waste. Janine leaned in. "That's Dr. Roberta Langston, neuroscientist. Used to teach at Stanford. She's retired now. Oversees our research." Gregory turned sharply. "Dr. Langston? You're the one who submitted the proposal to our foundation 3 times. The woman smiled with sharp eyes. "And you rejected us 3 times, but I do appreciate you finally showing up." She nodded toward the children. "We're studying the effect of non-directive, movement-based autonomy on neuroregeneration. The science behind chaos, if you will." Gregory narrowed his eyes. "This was supposed to be a community dance class." "It is, and also a field lab." Leona rejoined them, wiping a streak of glue from her hand, as a small child raced by with foam markers. "Motion Mind is a pilot study," she explained. "We combine adaptive movement with neuroscience to create emotional safety zones for children with neuromotor disorders." "Then why do you work as a bus driver?" Gregory asked. "Why hide behind that?" Leona's gaze was steady. "Because we lost our primary funder last year. Because people like you didn't believe in us. And bills still have to be paid." His voice turned to ice. "So you use my son to get me here?" "No. Dr. Langston interjected. Your son brought himself here. She just let him lead. Leona folded her arms. And what happened the night of the gala wasn't staged. Eli made the choice. I just followed. At that moment, the door burst open again. A small crowd of reporters entered, camera flashes already sparking. Gregory straightened, alarmed. What is this? Part 2, Janine said quietly, handing him a copy of that morning's headline. Revolutionary Rehabilitation Through Chaos. The program no one funded. We published our early findings today, Dr. Langston said, and invited the press. You rejected the idea. Maybe you won't reject the evidence. Gregory's face darkened. You exploited my son. We honored him, Leona replied, by letting him show the world what you never let him try. She led him into a small adjacent room. The walls were covered in photographs, children in movement, milestones recorded, laughter captured in stillness. Beneath each was a handwritten note. First unassisted step, first spin, first time smiling during motion. At the end of the wall was an empty frame. What's this? Gregory asked. Our future, Leona said. A real facility, with trained staff, accessible design, and the capacity to serve 500 children instead of 50? But it can't happen without belief. Or courage. Gregory's fist clenched at his sides. You orchestrated all of this. The gala, the invite, this moment. You lured me here. 4 months ago, Leona said evenly. You canceled our meeting without reading our proposal. I promised myself that day I'd find another way. Not for me, for them. Just then, Janine ran in, breathless. It's Eli! They rushed back into the main room. The music had stopped. The children were still. In the center of the space, Eli stood, surrounded by a semicircle of wide-eyed kids. One of his braces lay discarded at his feet. The boy was attempting to balance on just one support. Eli, Gregory started, moving forward. But Leona grabbed his arm. Wait! The boy took a shaky breath, focused. Then, with the silence of the room wrapping around him like breathless prayer, he shifted his weight and, slowly, deliberately, took a single step. 1 foot, 1 breath, 1 second of triumph, and then another. The room erupted, children clapped, reporters gasped, cameras flashed like fireworks. And Gregory Wallace, man of steel and stocks and impenetrable spreadsheets, felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Awe. Not at technology, not at himself, but at his son. And the woman who had simply let him move. Gregory Wallace stood frozen as the cheers and camera flashes rippled around him, but he wasn't hearing them. He wasn't hearing anything except the sound of his own heartbeat and the image of his son, Eli, standing without being commanded, without being assisted, without being corrected. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and it shattered every limitation Gregory had clung to since the accident. Every chart, every prognosis, every expensive whisper from therapists who promised results and delivered silence. Beside him, Leona's expression didn't gloat, didn't smirk. It simply softened with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew this was possible. Gregory's throat tightened with something unrecognizable. Was it shame? Regret? Gratitude? The weight of being wrong? Whatever it was, it stayed lodged as a reporter approached, eyes wide and mic extended. Mr. Wallace, could you comment on your presence here at Motion Mind today? Is it true your foundation denied this program 3 separate times? The question rang through the studio like a slow-motion bullet, slicing through the warmth of Eli's progress. Gregory felt the familiar reflex to retreat, to deny, to issue a statement through legal counsel to protect the brand. But then he saw Eli again, now laughing as a girl in a motorized wheelchair rolled beside him, mimicking his awkward step with a playful twirl, and he realized there was no room left to hide in the armor of reputation. He stepped forward slowly, the cameras now locked on his face, and for once in his perfectly engineered public life, he didn't speak like a CEO. He spoke like a man learning how to be a father. Do you know what's hardest for someone in my position? He asked, his voice carrying across the room. It's admitting when we're wrong. A hush fell. The Wallace Foundation is proud, honored, to announce full funding for the Motion Mind program for the next 5 years, including the construction of a new rehabilitation center based entirely on the methodology developed by Dr. Roberta Langston and Ms. Leona Carter. A collective gasp rose, followed by a second wave of camera flashes. But Gregory wasn't done. On one condition, he added, and Leona stiffened. That Ms. Carter retains complete autonomy over the program. No corporate interference, no diluted mission, no branding campaigns, just the work, as it is, as it was meant to be. Leona's eyes widened, and for a moment, the silence between them wasn't about conflict or class. It was about mutual recognition, a battlefield turned bridge. Behind them, Janine wept quietly, one hand over her mouth. Dr. Langston exhaled as if releasing 2 years of held breath. The next day, bulldozers rolled into the empty lot next to the warehouse, breaking ground on what would become the new Motion Mind Center. And over the next 3 months, something extraordinary unfolded. It wasn't just the construction of a building, it was the reconstruction of a man. Gregory began showing up to meetings, quietly, attentively. He didn't try to control, he listened. He began reading studies, meeting with parents, even staying late to observe sessions without announcing his presence. And Eli transformed. The boy who once sat silent in his own body began moving with purpose. He laughed more, struggled less, and pushed himself further. One afternoon, as the walls of the new center were being painted with the help of the kids themselves, Leona caught Gregory in the break room, hunched over a scientific journal with colorful post-its marking every other page. "I never thought I'd be studying neuroplasticity at 50, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "I never thought you'd show up to construction meetings," she replied. He looked up, tired but sincere. "Is this redemption, you think, or just public penance?" Leona didn't answer right away. Instead, she handed him a photo, Eli balancing on a single crutch, eyes shining. "Call it what you want," she said, "but your son asked to have his second brace removed last week. A therapist said it would take 2 years. You fired her because I told you she was wrong, and she was." Gregory looked down at the photo, then up at her. "Why won't you accept my apology?" She didn't blink. "Because you haven't said the words. You redirected funding, changed policy, elevated this program, but you never said you were sorry." His gaze dropped. "Fair enough," he murmured, and just like that, the man who once ruled over glass towers with a voice that stilled rooms was learning that some truths, the most important ones, must be spoken aloud. 6 months later, the grand opening of the new Motion Mind Rehabilitation Center was unlike anything Gregory Wallace had ever attended, and he had attended galas in Dubai, conferences in Berlin, and ribbon cuttings from Palo Alto to Geneva. But none had ever looked like this. There were no black-tie dress codes, no ivory linens, no orchestral quartets tucked into corners. Instead, the open courtyard of the new facility buzzed with laughter, with children moving freely, some with walkers, some in wheelchairs, some running barefoot across the soft rubber flooring designed to absorb both impact and fear. Bright murals painted by the kids themselves stretched across the walls, bearing slogans like "Your rhythm, your rules," and "Balance is a feeling, not a formula." In the center of it all, under a warm California sun filtered through wind-blown streamers, stood Eli Wallace, now wearing only a lightweight brace on his left leg, leading 3 other children in a short choreographed sequence that was simple, imperfect, and radiant with determination. His movements were still hesitant, but they flowed with a confidence no medical prognosis had predicted. Gregory stood at the edge of the crowd, wearing no suit, no tie, just a simple blue shirt and khakis, his hands in his pockets. He didn't need to be in the center, not anymore. Leona approached from the side, her polo shirt bearing the Motion Mind logo tucked neatly into jeans, a clipboard in one hand. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him, watching Eli finish his final turn and give a small bow that earned raucous applause from the children, parents, and reporters scattered throughout the courtyard. Then she said softly, "He doesn't need you to hold him anymore." Gregory nodded slowly. "No," he said, "but he still needs me to be around." He turned to her. "Crucial difference?" She smiled. "You figured that out on your own?" He smirked, eyes flicking toward his son. "Let's just say I had a good teacher." As if on cue, a reporter with a press badge approached them, microphone in hand, cameraman following. "Mr. Wallace," she said, How does it feel to see your son come this far? Gregory looked at Eli, who was now helping a younger boy with leg braces find his footing, and answered, proud, not just of what he's overcome, but of what he's creating for others. The reporter hesitated. And what's been the biggest lesson you've learned in this journey? Gregory's eyes didn't leave his son. His voice was clear, firm, but with a softness that hadn't existed a year ago. That real leadership, he said, isn't about guiding others down the path you think is right. It's about having the humility to follow when someone else shows you a better way. The reporter paused, visibly moved. Across the courtyard, Eli laughed as a balloon escaped a child's hand and floated into the sky. And for a long moment, everything, corporate agendas, past mistakes, societal roles, melted into the background, leaving only the image of a father finally learning to walk behind his son. A year had passed since that first trembling dance, and though the world outside the Motion Mind Center still moved at the ruthless pace of capitalism and appearances, something slower and far more permanent had taken root inside its walls, a revolution built not from algorithms or wealth, but from the radical idea that healing begins when control is surrendered and dignity is honored. The program had expanded to 3 new cities, Seattle, Chicago, and Atlanta, with local teams trained under Leona and Dr. Langston's guidance, each facility run with the same core philosophy: follow the child, let them lead. Hospitals began adopting Motion Mind's principles into their pediatric rehabilitation protocols, and the American Journal of Neurodevelopmental Medicine published a peer-reviewed article co-authored by Leona Carter and Dr. Langston, titled The Neurology of Autonomy: Movement, Meaning, and the Mind of the Child. At the annual Pediatric Innovation Awards in New York, Leona took the stage in a dark green dress borrowed from Janine, holding the crystal award with a steady hand, and tears she refused to wipe away. "This isn't mine," she told the crowd. "It belongs to every child who's ever been told their body was a problem to be solved, instead of a story to be listened to." Back in Oakland, the original Motion Mind Center remained open, repurposed into a training hub for community instructors, its walls still echoing with the laughter of children who had once been told to sit still and be quiet. As for Eli, he had transitioned into a mainstream public school, carrying with him a slim cane only on difficult days, but more often than not, choosing to move unaided, even if it meant moving slower. He had also become an unofficial youth spokesperson for the Motion Mind movement, speaking at events, recording short videos for new participants, reminding kids that their pace was valid, their steps their own. Gregory Wallace, once the architect of closed doors and clinical detachment, now attended every quarterly Motion Mind Board meeting, not as a donor who demanded control, but as a listener who took notes, asked questions, and deferred when answers weren't his to give. At home, he and Eli developed a quiet rhythm. Breakfasts that included real conversation, weekend visits to bookstores, long walks where Eli sometimes talked about the accident, not to rehash the pain, but to chart the journey forward. One Sunday evening, sitting on the edge of Eli's bed as the boy thumbed through a comic book, Gregory asked softly, "Do you think Mom would have liked what we're doing now?" Eli looked up, eyes steady. "She would have loved it, Dad, but she would have said it started with the dance." Gregory nodded slowly, his voice almost a whisper. "She always said connection matters more than correction." Outside, the wind moved through the trees like breath. Inside, father and son sat together in a silence that no longer felt like distance, but like understanding. And somewhere, beneath the weight of corporate legacies and personal failures, a man who had once believed power meant leading had discovered the greatest truth of all, that the most courageous act of leadership is not forging a path alone, but having the humility to follow when love dares to take the first step. By the time the second Motion Mind Center opened in Atlanta, the program had become more than a rehabilitation methodology. It had become a quiet revolution, sweeping through communities long ignored by traditional healthcare systems. And at its heart stood Leona Carter, no longer just a woman with a vision, but a symbol of what it meant to reimagine care with compassion as the blueprint. Schools began sending teachers to observe her techniques, insurers reluctantly took notice, and even skeptics in the medical world, who had once dismissed her as an uncredentialed anomaly, now cited her in symposiums on neurodevelopmental reformation. But for Leona, the greatest reward wasn't the headlines or handshakes. It was the moments that didn't make the press. A mother weeping as her daughter took her first independent turn in a movement circle. A boy who once screamed at the touch of music, now asking to be the DJ of the day. Or Eli, now taller, more grounded, helping a child learn to transfer from crutches to bare feet with the same patience once shown to him. On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, Leona stood in the empty Oakland Center after hours, barefoot on the smooth studio floor, her hand brushing against the new corkboard where children's self-portraits hung next to words like brave, strong, and I get to choose. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. It was Gregory Wallace, umbrella in hand, soaked to the shoulders but carrying a manila folder carefully shielded from the rain. "You're early," she said, smiling without turning. "You knew I'd come," he replied. "You always show up right before the hard parts." He handed her the folder, and inside was a personal letter of endowment, $10 million not from the Wallace Foundation, but from Gregory Wallace himself, with no tax shelters, no PR clauses, no control. "This is not compensation," he said. "This is me finally saying I'm sorry, out loud." For the first time since they'd met, Leona's breath caught. It wasn't the amount, it was the tone, the surrender in his voice. The man who once demanded the world conform to his terms now understood that some of the most valuable things in life require not invention, but invitation. "Apology accepted," she said quietly. "Not because of the check, because of the change." That night, after Gregory left, Leona sat alone in the middle of the studio floor, surrounded by silence and small evidence of large victories. Forgotten socks, crayon-scribbled thank you notes, taped-up milestones. She took out her journal, the same one she'd carried the night she danced with Eli, and began a new entry. "The empire doesn't fall with noise. It changes when someone listens." Outside, the rain eased. Inside, a legacy was being rewritten, not with dominance, with trust, not with force, but with following. The months that followed the personal endowment from Gregory Wallace were filled with movement, not just of bodies across therapy mats and dance floors, but of systems, minds, and long-entrenched expectations. With the security of Gregory's funding, Leona and Janine were able to transform the original Oakland warehouse into a national training hub, reimagining it with classrooms, an interactive sensory lab, and a community resource wing where families could learn, rest, and belong. But with growth came pressure. Leona found herself juggling board meetings, data reports, and national interviews, all while still showing up in sneakers and leading warm-up sessions with children whose first words in weeks were often whispered during a stretch or step. The work grounded her, but it also stretched her thin. One Friday afternoon, after a long session with a 6-year-old girl recovering from selective mutism, Leona collapsed into the break room couch, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. Across the room, Janine raised an eyebrow. "You've been in 3 cities in 5 days. Even your coffee looks tired." Leona laughed weakly. "Do you think I'm turning into them?" Janine looked up from her laptop. "Them as in bureaucrats?" "No, them as in people who build things so big they forget what it felt like to start with nothing." Janine closed her screen. "Leona, you know why Motion Mind is different? Because you're terrified of that. That alone keeps us honest." Leona nodded, grateful. Still, something tugged at her, a weightless dread. Maybe it was the gala invitation from Stanford's neuroscience department sitting unopened in her inbox, or the fact that Eli, now entering middle school, had started asking deeper questions about his mom, about why his dad used to be so distant, about what came after healing. One evening, after a late-night planning session, Gregory asked Leona if they could take a walk through the new construction site of the San Diego facility, which was nearing completion. As they stepped carefully through the half-finished corridors, Gregory paused in what would soon be the main sensory movement hall. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice lower than usual. "Always. What happens if this becomes too big? What if it gets away from you?" Leona leaned against a plywood beam. "Then we return to the floor, to the rhythm, to the reason. Programs only fail when people forget who they're really for." Gregory nodded. "And what if people start attacking it?" She turned to him, brow furrowed. "Why would they?" "Because they always do," he replied grimly. "You're shifting power away from institutions, giving it to kids, to community. That makes people uncomfortable, especially people who build their identity around fixing others. His words prove prophetic. 2 weeks later, Motion Mind was thrust into the national spotlight, not by a profile or an award, but by a viral video posted by a conservative commentator mocking a session in which a non-verbal autistic boy led a full-body movement class using only hand signals and humming. "This is what happens when you let emotion replace science," the caption read. "Chaos disguised as care." The video racked up 2 million views in 48 hours. Suddenly, reporters who once celebrated the motion mind returned with harder questions. Is this therapy or performance? Are unlicensed instructors truly qualified? Is the motion mind model undermining traditional medical authority? Leona faced it head-on. She called a press conference. Gregory stood beside her, as did Dr. Langston and 3 parents whose children had made groundbreaking recoveries in the program. Cameras clicked. Questions flew. "We don't reject science," Leona said, her voice clear. "We expand it. We don't erase structure. We redefine it. And we don't pretend to cure children. We empower them to lead their own growth." Still, the noise didn't die. A major insurance provider threatened to cut coverage for motion mind-based therapy, citing insufficient standardization. An anonymous op-ed accused Leona of emotional manipulation. "They don't want to dismantle your work," Gregory told her one night as they stood in the glow of the Oakland Center's outdoor mural. "They want to make you feel small again, but you're not the same woman who stood in that gala ballroom with a kid in a brace." "No," Leona whispered. "Now I'm the woman who has to protect 100 other kids with braces." The battle wasn't just public, it was personal. Eli, now 12, had found the video. "Why are people making fun of something that helped me?" he asked her one evening, eyes dimmed by confusion. "Because they don't understand it yet," she said softly. "And sometimes, when people don't understand something beautiful, they try to destroy it." He paused. "Should I stop dancing?" "Never," she said, her voice breaking. "You're not dancing for them. You're dancing for the boy you used to be, and for the ones still waiting." A week later, something shifted. A video surfaced, not edited, not sensationalized, but a simple recording of a motion mind class in Seattle, where a girl who had not spoken in 2 years suddenly sang a lullaby while moving through a ribbon routine. It wasn't shared by a journalist or a PR team. It was posted by her father, a war veteran who wrote in the caption, "This isn't chaos, this is resurrection." That post eclipsed the original smear campaign within days. News outlets reframed the story. Experts began re-evaluating motion mind data. Hospitals reopened talks. The storm had passed, but Leona knew better now. It would come again. So, she began writing, not for press, not for publication, but for preservation. She compiled every journal entry, every anecdote, every child's breakthrough into a manuscript she titled "Let Them Lead, A New Language for Healing." And in it, she wrote, "We don't build revolutions by yelling. We build them by listening, by kneeling when a child reaches up, by stepping back when they step forward, and by knowing that the most powerful people in the room are often the smallest." The manuscript remained unpublished, hidden in a drawer, but its spirit echoed in every child who entered Motion Mind. And one quiet evening, as Leona walked through the Oakland studio alone, the lights dimmed and the floor empty, she heard the soft tapping of braces behind her. She turned. Eli stood there, taller than she remembered, his cane gone, his eyes bright. "Can I dance with you?" he asked. And without a word, she took his hand, not to guide, but to follow, and together they moved through the quiet room, step by unsteady step, into whatever came next. By spring, the Motion Mind name had become a quiet anthem passed between parents, educators, and therapists, searching for something gentler than clinical scripts and more honest than prescriptive milestones. It wasn't just a program anymore, it was a movement that challenged the very definition of progress, asking not how fast a child could conform to expected norms, but how safely they could unfold into themselves. In Washington, a senator's aide discreetly requested a tour of the Oakland Center. In New Orleans, a mother donated her backyard to turn it into a micro-hub for local children. In New York, a physical therapist abandoned her position at a prestigious hospital to retrain under Leona's team. But amid the blooming growth, Leona found herself haunted not by failure, but by success. One night, well after everyone had gone home, she remained seated on the studio floor, barefoot, surrounded by silence and faint scuff marks of tiny braces that had once tapped out fear and now whispered freedom. The journal on her lap was open to a blank page, her pen uncapped, yet her hand did not move. Gregory entered quietly, a box of takeout in hand. "You skipped dinner again," he said, placing the food on the nearby bench. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was softer than usual. "Do you ever worry that you're no longer necessary to the thing you created?" He sat beside her, folding his long limbs onto the mat. "Every day, especially now that Eli doesn't need me to walk him into school anymore." She looked at him then, genuinely. "So, how do you stay involved?" He smiled faintly. "I remember it's not about being needed. It's about being present." That night, as they ate from shared containers and talked about paint colors for the upcoming center in Chicago, something unspoken solidified between them, something neither romantic nor formal, but rooted in respect forged by witnessing each other at their rawest. Weeks later, Gregory was asked to speak on a panel at a global neurotech summit. Rather than discussing his own company, he dedicated his full keynote to motion mind. "I used to measure success in patents and stock valuation," he said, voice steady. "Now I measure it in steps, real, unassisted, glorious first steps." His statement went viral. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline, "From boardrooms to barefoot floors, how a billionaire learned to follow." And yet, Leona's favorite moment that month had nothing to do with media or expansion. It happened on a random Thursday during a parent observation hour in the Oakland studio. A child who had been entirely nonverbal for 4 years was attempting a solo movement for the first time. His mother, sitting beside Leona, gripped her hand so tightly it hurt. "I was told he'd never do this," the woman whispered. "Never connect, never initiate. They said his mind was locked." Leona didn't answer with words. She simply squeezed back, tears catching in her throat as the child completed his first self-initiated sequence. Small, imperfect, revolutionary. After the session, as the children began packing up, Eli walked up to the boy and offered a high five. It was returned without hesitation. Connection. Leona stood quietly in the doorway, watching the exchange, watching Gregory, who had just arrived and was leaning casually against the wall, no longer trying to fix everything, simply witnessing. In that still moment, she realized something deeper than satisfaction. This wasn't about proving the world wrong anymore. It was about proving to these children, and to themselves, that they had always been right to believe healing doesn't come from power, but from presence, from being seen, from being allowed to move at one's own pace, from being asked, "Do you want to lead?" and then hearing, truly hearing, the answer. And as the sun poured amber light across the floor, Leona finally wrote into the blank page in her journal, "The revolution is not loud. It is tender. It happens every time someone chooses to follow a child instead of correcting them, and when that choice is repeated, day after day, it becomes freedom." The announcement came quietly at first, just a short paragraph in a policy update email from the National Pediatric Rehabilitation Association. But to those who had been fighting on the margins for years, it landed like thunder. Motion mind principles approved for inclusion in National Pediatric Rehabilitation Curriculum Standards. Leona reread the line 3 times in the fluorescent light of her office, the words soft on paper, but roaring in her chest. What began with a dance, a simple act of trust between a boy and a woman who refused to bow to hierarchy, had now reshaped policy. For the first time, therapists in training across the country would learn not just how to correct movement, but how to follow it. Still holding the email, Leona walked barefoot into the main studio and sat where Eli had taken his first unsteady step. The studio was empty, but she could still hear the ghost echoes of laughter, the scrape of braces, the rhythm of resistance turned into joy. Janine appeared moments later, carrying 2 coffees. "They sent it?" Leona nodded. "They're teaching it." Janine smiled, her face soft with awe. "You didn't just build a program, you rewrote the instructions." Later that week, at a celebration hosted at the Oakland Hub, families filled the space with music, food, and stories. Parents whose children had once been labeled untrainable now stood in circles swapping progress photos. One mother brought a scrapbook filled with sticky notes her daughter had written after each session. "Today I led, today I was strong, Today I didn't need help, and that felt amazing. Leona moved quietly through the crowd, her presence calm and steady, as always. Gregory arrived late, as was his recent habit, never for show, always for presence. He no longer stood in the spotlight, he stood beside it. During a toast, he spoke only one sentence. This place changed my son, but more importantly, it changed his father. As the crowd applauded, Eli, now 13, braces long gone, height nearly matching his father's, stepped up behind the mic. "Motion Mind isn't just where I learned to walk again," he said, voice clear. "It's where I learned I didn't have to be fixed, I just had to be followed." Silence fell, thick and sacred. Then came a rising wave of claps, cheers, tears. And in the back of the room, Leona leaned against the doorframe, a hand over her mouth, her eyes rimmed with emotion she didn't bother hiding. That night, after everyone had left, Gregory found her again sitting on the studio floor, legs crossed, shoes off, the room dim but warm. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted quietly. "This part, this dream, I've held it for so long. What do you do when it starts dreaming back?" He sat beside her without speaking for a while. Finally he answered, "You rest, just long enough to breathe. Then you find the next child standing in a shadow, and you walk toward them, not to lead, just to offer your hand." She closed her eyes, exhaled slowly. "I never wanted this to be about me." "It never was," he replied. "That's what made it so powerful." Outside, the stars blinked over Oakland like quiet witnesses. Inside, a woman who had once been a bus driver, once been overlooked, once been invisible, now sat at the center of a revolution. One built not on authority, but on grace. One not owned, but shared. One that began with a question. What if we let the child lead, and evolved into an answer that changed lives across the country? And though she didn't know what would come next, Leona knew one thing with unshakable clarity. The path forward would not be paved in steel or cement. It would be made of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and free. It was during the third annual Motion Mind National Summit in Chicago, inside the sunlit atrium of the newly opened Lakeview Center, that Leona Carter was asked the question she least expected, and yet had somehow always been waiting for. The room was filled with educators, therapists, parents, researchers, and even skeptics who had now become curious collaborators. She'd just finished her keynote, an unscripted reflection on the difference between guidance and control, when a teenage boy in the back raised his hand during the Q&A. "Miss Carter?" he asked, voice cracking slightly with youth. "How do you know when it's time to let go?" The room quieted. Even the journalists stopped scribbling. Leona paused, her breath catching slightly as if the question had reached deeper than anyone else could see. She scanned the faces in the audience, then glanced toward the front row, where Eli sat beside Janine, legs crossed, wearing a Motion Mind hoodie and tapping a rhythm against his knee that only he understood. "You let go," she said slowly, "when you know they've learned how to hold themselves. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to know who they are, even when no one's watching." The boy nodded thoughtfully. The room clapped quietly, not the kind of applause for performance, but for truth. Later that evening, as the summit's reception wound down and the halls emptied, Eli pulled her aside. "I know what he was really asking," he said. She tilted her head. "Do you?" "Yeah," he said. "He wasn't asking about kids. He was asking about you, about what happens when you've done enough." Leona smiled faintly. "And what do you think the answer is?" Eli looked up at her with the same serious expression he wore the day he took his first step without a brace. "I think it means it's time for you to do something for you." That night, back in her hotel room overlooking the lake, Leona couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the ripples on the water, and thinking about all the children whose stories had rippled into her own. Eli, of course, but also Ava from the Bronx, who now led peer sessions in her wheelchair, Mateo in Arizona, who painted his way out of silence, and Raya in Seattle, whose humming became a symphony of self-trust. She realized that her role had shifted, subtly, then profoundly. She was no longer the spark. She was the keeper of flame, the one ensuring it didn't die in the hands of those still learning to carry it. 2 weeks later, she surprised everyone, including herself, by stepping down from day-to-day operations at Motion Mind. She wasn't leaving, not entirely, but she was making space, For new leaders, new voices, new methods, she handed the executive director position to Janine, who had quietly built the logistical backbone of the movement all along. The announcement came with no fanfare, just a simple letter sent to staff and families. Movements grow when we trust others to move them. And so, Leona began visiting places without press, without itinerary, small community programs in rural towns, reservation schools, border shelters, places where children still moved in shadows. She listened more than she spoke. She followed more than she taught. And in those quiet corners of the country, the motion mind philosophy began to mutate, evolve, and root itself in new soil, not as a rigid model, but as a living language. One day, in a church basement in Mississippi, she watched a group of children with learning differences choreograph a stomp routine that made the floor shake with laughter. The instructor was 19. He had never heard of motion mind. He had just found his own way in. And in that, she saw the future, not built by her hands, but by the ones who had learned what freedom felt like and decided it was worth passing on. Leona Carter, once a bus driver, once a waitress, once overlooked, now walked into every space not as the center of the story, but as its soil. And in doing so, she discovered the most powerful truth of all, that the greatest leaders do not stand at the front of the room. They kneel beside the child who dares to rise and whisper, "I'm right behind you." Years passed, quietly at first, and then all at once, as movements often do, when they stop being seen as radical and start becoming necessary. The motion mind philosophy had not only spread, it had rooted, taken form, become part of institutional memory across schools, clinics, homes, and policy rooms. What began with a whispered question, "May I dance with you?" had become a language now spoken across generations. And yet, Leona Carter never took credit. Her name appeared in journals, yes. Her face appeared in one or two textbooks, sometimes in guest lectures, always paired with Eli's iconic first dance photo. But she never allowed the story to orbit her. Instead, she kept moving. She became a consultant for community programs in forgotten zip codes. She visited prison-based parenting groups, worked with veterans therapy centers, and trained refugee camp educators to use movement as communication before words could be rebuilt. She wrote letters to children in shelters who had seen too much to trust anyone but their own limbs. And she never stopped showing up barefoot to unfamiliar spaces, not as a leader, but as a listener. On the 10th anniversary of the original Motion Mind Center, hundreds gathered in Oakland under string lights and soft music. The floor of the studio was covered with paper footprints, each representing a child who had once taken their first voluntary step there. Eli, now in college and studying adaptive education, flew in for the celebration, wearing no cane, no assistive gear, just a quiet calm that made people turn when he entered the room. During the ceremony, Janine stood on stage and read letters from families across the country, some whose children could now walk, others who would never walk, but had learned to move with joy and consent. Then she handed the microphone to Eli. "A decade ago," he said, "my life was supposed to shrink. After the accident, everyone told me what I'd never do again. But then someone didn't try to fix me. She just followed." He turned to the corner of the room where Leona stood, half hidden in the crowd, hand pressed to her mouth. "Leona Carter taught me that leading doesn't always mean stepping forward. Sometimes it means stepping aside. Sometimes it means kneeling. Sometimes it means holding space so someone else can rise." The room fell quiet. A tear slid down Gregory Wallace's cheek. No longer the mogul he once was, but now a father, a board member, a man who had unlearned power to relearn presence. After the event, Leona walked alone through the darkened studio, fingers grazing the mural that now stretched along the back wall. At the center of it was the image of a child reaching upward, surrounded not by adults pointing the way, but by silhouettes kneeling, open-handed, waiting. She stood there a long time, breathing in the echoes. Then, without warning, a small voice behind her said, "Miss Leona, will you dance with me?" She turned. A boy no older than 8, braces on both legs, eyes wide with that same fragile hope she'd seen in Eli all those years ago. She smiled, nodded, and stepped forward, not ahead, not above, beside. They moved slowly through the darkened room, lit only by soft wall sconces and the memory of 1,000 first steps. And in that moment, Leona Carter knew. She had never left the revolution. She had simply learned how to let others carry it, one sacred, stumbling, unstoppable step at a time. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't begin in boardrooms or on battlefields, but in the quiet courage of a single moment. A dance, a step, a choice to follow instead of control. Leona Carter didn't set out to change the world. She simply listened, knelt beside a child, and offered her hand. And in doing so, she reminded all of us, real strength doesn't shout, it supports. And real leadership doesn't demand to be seen, it sees others first. If this story moved you, made you think, or simply reminded you of the kind of world we could build with more compassion, please like, share, and subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another child is still waiting for someone to say, "I'll follow your lead." This is Flow Story, where one moment can change everything.